"I'm just waiting here for my niece." Colonel Jerome barely got the words out. "Get up! I'm the law here, especially with black folks. No exceptions," Officer Simmons barked, pressing a Glock to the temple of a calm, uniformed black man sitting in his SUV. What Simmons didn't know? That man was Colonel Jerome Carter, a decorated U.S. Army commander who once led hundreds into battle. 10 minutes later, the entire National Defense Response System lit up, and Simmons, the cop who thought he could abuse anyone, got his first call from the Pentagon. Justice isn't silent anymore, and this time it wears stars on its shoulders. What state do you live in? Has this happened where you are? It was midday in June. The heat in Virginia wasn't unbearable, but the sun poured down on the asphalt like a thick layer of oil. The air was heavy, dense, and reflected off the glass windows of the old-style houses lining the street. On a quiet road in the Westbrook neighborhood, a black SUV was parked neatly along the curb, engine still running. No horn, no hazard lights, no one getting in or out. Inside the vehicle sat Jerome Carter, eyes fixed on apartment number 34, where his niece had just texted that she was coming down. She needed him to drive her to pick up some final paperwork from the Auxiliary Officer Academy, the last step before she would officially be assigned to her unit. Nothing urgent, nothing illegal, just an older man waiting quietly in his car. A scene so mundane it should have gone unnoticed. But for people like Jerome, mundane wasn't an option. On his shoulder were the insignia of a colonel, 3 small silver stars, not flashy but unmistakable. His deep olive uniform was perfectly pressed, with the name tag Carter on the left and the U.S. Army Command insignia on the right. He wasn't showing off, but he wasn't hiding it either. It was simply what he wore during his regular visits to veteran support and new officer coordination program. He didn't turn on the radio or check his phone. He just sat, upright and still, eyes on the front steps, his presence as disciplined and orderly as his uniform. The only sound inside was the soft hum of the AC through a slightly cracked window. The mix of leather and military fabric filled the car with a dry, sterile scent, familiar and clean. At the far end of the street, a police cruiser turned in slowly, with no lights, no siren. It passed Jerome's SUV, then came to a sudden stop just a few meters ahead. The door opened, and out stepped a solid-built officer with a buzz cut and reflective sunglasses. The badge on his chest read Millstone City Police. Simmons. He didn't check the license plate, didn't glance around. His eyes locked immediately on the black man sitting alone in a high-end vehicle. Suspicion required no justification when the target had the wrong skin color. Jerome didn't flinch. He'd seen that stare before, at checkpoints in Fallujah, in immigration offices in Georgia. A look that wasn't searching for answers, only for a reason to act. He quietly exhaled, took his hands off the steering wheel and rested them on his thighs, a neutral, visible gesture signaling readiness to cooperate. Simmons moved slowly toward the car, left hand flipping open a notepad, right hand hovering near his waist, close to his Glock. His eyes stayed locked on Jerome. No greeting, no smile, no polite inquiry, just silence, thick like the summer air, ready to break. The air between the two men thickened, as if the temperature had dropped a few degrees without warning. Simmons stood right by the car door, not drawing his gun, but his hand hovered near the strap at his hip, a gesture any combat veteran would read as a warning. His gaze was cold, not with reason, but with the conviction of someone used to being obeyed. What he wasn't used to was slowness, not the slowness of age, but of someone unbothered by pressure. Someone who doesn't believe they need to hurry to satisfy someone else's authority. Jerome Carter didn't move. He didn't turn, didn't react to the implied command. His eyes remained steady, his hands resting calmly on his thighs, posture straight like a night shift guard back at base. He said, "I repeat, I am not operating the vehicle. I am legally parked, and under current Virginia law, unless you have probable cause or specific suspicious behavior, you have no right to demand my personal documents." His tone was calm, not raised, but firm enough to make the man in front of him blink. Simmons froze. He hadn't expected a legally grounded response. He had been waiting for nervousness, fear, or at least some emotional reaction he could escalate into justification. But what he got was knowledge, and that unsettled him. Half a second later, he smirked. "The law here is what I say it is when I'm standing in front of you," he said, voice grinding like rusted steel. It wasn't a statement meant for discussion, but a declaration of dominance, not justice, habit. Habit, built on the compliance of those too tired to resist, or too low to force him to retreat. Jerome didn't answer right away. He tilted his head slightly, glanced across the street, where a woman stood behind a thin curtain, holding her phone aimed at them. A man nearby pretended to talk on his own phone, but didn't take his eyes off Simmons's hand. Jerome turned back, his eyes calm, not angry, just assessing. Then he spoke again, quietly but clearly. "I've served this country for over 30 years. I know protocol, and I know my rights." There was no drama in his voice, no bravado, only a sentence forged from principle, and that, more than open defiance, offended Simmons, standing before a man he couldn't break with a badge. Simmons gritted his teeth. His breathing was uneven. He was used to steering situations with tone, threats, or a palm slammed on the hood, but today he faced a man who didn't move, not out of fear, but out of strength that didn't need to defend itself. Flustered, Simmons did what he always did when logic failed. He reached for his citation book. With a harsh tug, he pulled it from his chest pocket, uncapped his pen, and leaned down as if to replace an unspoken command with ink. But Jerome's eyes didn't leave Simmons' right hand, still hovering near the gun. Both men knew the scene could shift with a single wrong move. Both were waiting to see who would lose control first. "All right then," Simmons said, with a crooked grin, his fingers clenching the pen like it was something more dangerous. "Not cooperating? Fine." He bent over the citation pad, scribbling quickly, though no one present believed he was following procedure. There was no violation code, no legal statute cited. He didn't need the law. All he needed was an excuse to assert that the man in the car had no right to dignity. What Simmons failed to see was that he was up against a different kind of strength, one born of not needing to resist. Jerome didn't look at the citation book. He kept watching Simmons' right hand, still close to the grip of his firearm, as if his gaze alone could stabilize the situation. Then he asked, tone unchanged, "What are you writing in there?" It wasn't a challenge, but it wasn't avoidance either. Simmons didn't look up. "Documenting non-compliance," he growled. Jerome took a deep breath, letting the air pass through him like a quiet filter for the absurdity in front of him. "You've given no valid reason for a stop, no traffic violation, no suspicious behavior, no system alert. I request you cite legal grounds before proceeding with any further action." That was the second refusal, and it startled Simmons, the way sudden stillness startles a predator used to flinching prey. Now the act couldn't be sustained. Simmons snapped the citation book closed, the sound louder than the traffic in the distance. He stepped close to the window, leaned in, voice pressed low and tight. "Get out of the car, now." His lips nearly touched the window slit, his breath stinking of cigarettes and contempt. But Jerome didn't budge. He shook his head, slowly, clearly, without fear. "I will not exit this vehicle unless you present a lawful reason." No shouting, no posturing, just a statement, delivered like a conclusion already weighed. That was the third refusal, and the next second Simmons couldn't take it anymore. He yanked at the holster strap. A sharp click rang out in the summer heat, quiet but crisp, as a warning only the aware would understand. A few pedestrians froze. A woman across the street gasped, her hands trembling around her phone. Something in the way Simmons leaned closer to the car made it clear. This had moved beyond a routine check. Still, Jerome didn't flint. His gaze held, not provocative, not evasive, just a reflection of a man who had faced worse violence, in places where uniforms weren't worn for honor, but for survival. And what kept him steady wasn't battlefield memory. It was knowing that if he backed down today, Simmons would believe he had the right to do this to someone else tomorrow. And just as Simmons tensed again, on the verge of drawing his weapon, across the street, a silent signal was sent. A young man in plain clothes tapped rapidly on his phone, entering a code no one else would recognize, then hit send. It wasn't a call for help. It was a strategic-level incident report, triggered when a service member is threatened on civilian ground, a protocol Simmons had never learned because it was never meant for men like him. The first sound wasn't a gunshot nor a shout. It was the soft slide of the gun strap slipping past the safety loop as Simmons drew his Glock, a sound only those who'd survived the battlefield would recognize and understand the gravity it signaled. He didn't need to issue a command, didn't need a reason. He simply couldn't stand the calm facing him. Simmons' right hand gripped the gun firmly, index finger not yet on the trigger, but resting inside the guard, as if the smallest motion would end it all. He pointed it straight through the window, the barrel black, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a wounded pride struck where it hurt most. Across from him, Jerome remained still, his face is unchanged, shoulders not flinching, eyes not widened like people's reflexes when staring down a gun. He simply turned his head slightly, gaze settling on the barrel with a terrifying slowness, as if assessing a weapon he'd seen too often to be surprised. That calm wasn't learned in stress response training at police headquarters. It was forged over the years in Iraq, in every minute straddling the line between life, death, error, and decision. But today what Jerome saw was an American barrel on American soil. Simmons screamed, his voice losing its authority. "Hands on the dashboard, now!" But Jerome didn't comply. His hands stayed resting on his thighs where they had been the whole time. No threat, no movement, no resistance. And that was what threw Simmons off. Every action Jerome made, his breathing, the angle of his head, fell outside every dangerous behavior model police are trained to handle, and precisely because he couldn't be categorized, Simmons grew more tense. Across the street, a woman covered her mouth in shock. Her phone, still recording, slipped from her hand, bounced off the pavement, and lay still. A child was pulled into a house by his mother, eyes too young to grasp the scene, but old enough to see the gun. A middle-aged man stopped in the street, pulled out his phone and started filming, hands shaking but steady enough, blurry clips, no sound, tilted angles, but more than enough to tell a truth. A black man being held at gunpoint for doing nothing, and the one holding the gun wore the uniform society calls justice. "I'm unarmed," Jerome said, voice steady. "I haven't stepped out of the vehicle. I've made no threatening movement. I'm just waiting for my niece." "You're pointing a gun at an active-duty military officer in uniform." He paused, locking eyes with Simmons. "Do you understand that?" The question wasn't loud, not fiery, but it landed with the weight of an indictment, one meant for a man who thought himself a judge. Simmons squinted. He knew he couldn't answer. Every word was being recorded by the dash cam, by his body cam, by phones across the street. All evidence of something he wasn't ready for. At this time, he had drawn on the wrong man. Jerome didn't move. He just exhaled, not out of relief, but because something had begun. In his left chest pocket was a small device, no larger than 2 knuckles. No light, no sound. But it existed for moments like this, when reason failed, and one uniform was threatened by another. It wasn't time to use it yet, but Jerome lightly touched the edge of his shirt, a silent cue to himself. "I'm alive, and I still have options." Wind brushed down the street, carrying the smudged feel of heat and an unnamed dread. But Simmons's hand didn't lower. The Glock still pointed at the window, and by the way he stood it was clear. Even a cough could make his finger twitch. His palm was sweating now. Not from fear, from confusion, because he couldn't understand why the man in front of him showed no fear. Every second Jerome didn't react, didn't yell, didn't flinch was another crack in Simmons' illusion of control. Instinct made him shout, "I'm ordering you to get out of the car." But what came back was a silence too deliberate to ignore. Not the silence of submission, the silence of someone ready to let the system expose itself. Jerome didn't reply. Instead, he slowly raised his left hand, a deliberate motion, so slow even the people recording across the street held their breath. He didn't touch the door, didn't pull anything out. He simply opened the front of his uniform, where a small pocket lay stitched inside, and in a split second he pressed twice on the side of a small object inside that pocket. No one saw it, no one heard a sound, but from a military communication node in Arlington, 120 miles away, a priority DEFCON gray alert was received and routed. Simmons remained unaware. He still stood there, gun shaking more than before. No more shouting, no more commands, just heavy breathing. Sweat streamed down his temple, past his ears, dripping to his collar. His right hand had gone numb from holding a position too long, but he wouldn't lower the gun, because if he did, he'd have to meet the eyes of the man inside the car and face the question, "What am I doing?" And he wasn't ready to answer that. Jerome held his gaze steady. But beneath the calm exterior, his entire response system had shifted into combat mode. He knew exactly what signal the device had just sent, and who would receive it. A coordination team from the Department of Defense, an emergency contact desk at the Pentagon, and most importantly, the Strategic Officer Safety Center for Active Personnel, a place that doesn't wait for permission to respond, a place that exists for when the national flag is threatened not by enemies, but by those with cuffs and guns in this very city. As Simmons stood frozen, elsewhere, hundreds of kilometers away, a console lit up. The screen read, "Active duty. Officer. 3 detected. Identified. Carter. Jerome. Code level strategic." 3 minutes later, a silver, unmarked civilian vehicle departed Fort Myer. It wasn't speeding, no sirens, but the direction was unmistakable. Jerome exhaled slowly. Not from stress, but because he knew the game had slipped out of the gunman's hands. Through calm, through knowledge of the system, and through unwavering belief in what he was doing, he had pushed the entire scenario into an irreversible state. Without shouting, without resistance, he simply held his ground and let the system crash into itself. From this point on, it was no longer a personal clash between a cop and a soldier. It would become an institutional collision between what America claims to protect and what is actually happening on its streets. Jerome remained seated, eyes fixed on the gun pointed at him. Nothing in the scene moved, no breeze blew. The only sounds on the street were the distant hum of an engine and the pounding heartbeats of those watching from behind phone screens. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was dense, heavy, and tense, like a thunderstorm being held back by one man's will. Then, slowly, Jerome raised his right hand, not fast, not shaky, just slow enough to make it clear he posed no threat. He reached into the chest pocket on his left, pulled out a thin, cold, silver-coated metal badge bearing an embedded barcode, the laser-etched emblem of the Department of Defense, and a classification code most people had never seen. It wasn't a driver's license. It wasn't an ID card. It was a living credential for a rank the U.S. Constitution requires to be recognized. Jerome didn't raise it like a plea. He didn't wave it, shout, or beg to be understood. He simply held it in his palm and lifted it to the window, toward the man with the gun, a declaration of identity that someone like Simmons was duty-bound to acknowledge, not by instinct, but by law. "Jerome Carter," he said, voice clear, each word deliberate, not loud, not cold. U.S. Army Colonel, Strategic Advisor, Human Rights Security Division, Human Joint Forces Office. He paused. Special clearance, protected under federal statute 1812, Article 4.1. It wasn't an introduction. It was an administrative notification, one Simmons was legally obligated to record if properly trained. But Simmons didn't listen. He didn't read the badge, didn't scan the barcode, didn't notice the Department of Defense insignia. Instead, he looked into Jerome's eyes and felt insulted by the very calmness in them. He didn't see a man cooperating. He saw a black man asserting a status above his command, and to Simmons, that was unacceptable. His grip on the Glock tightened, and the muzzle pressed harder against the glass. "I don't care who you are," Simmons shouted. "I'm the police here. I give the orders." His voice cracked at the end as if even he was losing control over his unraveling nervous system. Behind him, a second figure appeared, a younger officer in the same uniform. Slim build, eyes still unweathered. He stopped a few meters away, didn't approach, didn't intervene. He simply stood, as if still trying to process what he was witnessing. The red light on his body cam was still on. He saw the gun, he saw the badge, he saw the phone's recording from across the street, but he lacked the seniority to override his superior's command and the courage to yell stop in a moment where careers could be destroyed by a single word. Jerome didn't demand help. He glanced at the young officer, not pleading, not signaling, then turned back, eyes locking once again onto Simmons. He lifted the badge slightly higher, just enough to catch the sunlight and reflect the Pentagon emblem of the DoD in a cold flicker. It was a small move, but it was a final warning, not to avoid conflict, but to confirm one last time. If you proceed, you can't say you didn't know who I am. The badge caught the light in a strange, deliberate way. Under the Virginia midday sun, its silver coating didn't shine. It glinted like steel. That reflection passed across at least 3 phone cameras recording from across the street. One of them, thanks to digital zoom, captured it clearly. The Pentagon emblem in the top corner. The embedded line Department of Defense Strategic Personnel Identification, and a faint classification number matching interagency access. For anyone with military experience, it only took half a second to know. This was an active, high-ranking officer with access to internal response systems. But Simmons didn't know, and more importantly, he didn't want to know. He turned to look at the badge, but his eyes didn't register it. He didn't read, didn't analyze, didn't question. He saw it as a symbol of defiance, as if legality itself was mocking him. He didn't see authority in that badge, only a black man daring to assert parallel power in front of him. And like all who rely on fear to maintain control, Simmons had no answer but to scream, "Put that damn badge down! I don't care what crap you're flashing." His voice cracked again, not a command, but a desperate rejection of a silence he couldn't break. Jerome didn't reply. He didn't lower the badge, didn't respond to the insult. He just clenched his grip, not to protect the badge, but to affirm, once and for all, the warning had been given. On his left shoulder, the triple star insignia gleamed quietly. On his right sleeve, the Strategic Defense Training Unit patch was clearly visible. Everyone could see it. Simmons saw it. The young officer behind him saw it. The people across the street saw it. Only one man chose not to. Inside Jerome's SUV, the emergency routing device remained silent. No lights, no beeps. But the protocol had already started. Within 3 minutes of activation, the Department of Defense's internal comms system relayed the situation to 3 facilities: the Eastern Special Coordination Office, the Joint Forces Behavioral Control Center, and the Domestic Intervention Bureau at the Pentagon. Every word Simmons said, every motion, from verbal commands to weapon positioning, had been digitized, logged, and flagged as a strategic threat. He didn't know that, but it was already happening. A silver-gray, unmarked civilian SUV had just left Fort Myer, 80 miles away. Inside were 3 individuals in plain clothes, one from the military's Incident Response Analysis Division, one from Homeland Security, and the third, the Deputy Commander of Special Officer Protection. No sirens, no shouting, no radio alerts. They said only one line: maintain the situation. Avoid civilian interference. Transfer of command will be completed within 10 minutes. Back on the street, where Simmons still raged with a trembling gun in his hand, Jerome closed his eyes for a brief second, not to retreat, not out of fear, but like a soldier counting down to detonation. He knew, after today, this would no longer be just another case of racial profiling. It would become a systemic confrontation, where civilian authority shoots holes into its own legitimacy. He thought he was in control, but in truth he had 10 minutes left to keep his badge. While Simmons's gun remained pressed against Jerome Carter's forehead, and every gaze was locked on the trembling officer facing a man who showed no fear, across the street, on the second floor of apartment 37, a man named Marcus Baines stood up. His hair was streaked with premature gray, but his frame remained solid, always upright, like a soldier who had never left his post. A veteran of Iraq, once stationed in Mosul, he had taken direct orders from Colonel Carter during the 2006 Qadisiyah corridor clearance operation. He didn't need to see a nameplate to know who was inside that SUV. The voice, deep, firm, uncompromising, and the calm, unflinching eyes under threat were all he needed. Marcus understood. Jerome wasn't stepping back. And if he wasn't, then this was no longer personal. It signaled a threat the system itself would have to reckon with if it chose the wrong response. Marcus didn't call 911 or alert anyone. He closed the door, pulled the curtain, and sat at his desk, where an old laptop sat open. On screen was a no-frills application with a single line. Enter code string. No call button, no cancel, just one purpose. Created exclusively for veterans in a strategic support network, to be used only when a high-ranking officer's life was in danger on U.S. soil and the civilian system was unwilling or unable to act. Marcus typed, Delta Strat 12-9 Alpha. The screen blinked once, locked itself, no confirmation, no sound. But Marcus knew, as did Jerome, this was a strategic emergency trigger, one that bypassed all civilian layers and reached directly into the Defense Department's core systems. He stood, looked again out the window, and the gun hadn't lowered, but the protocol had begun. In under 20 seconds, a backup server at Fort Belvoir's Emergency Coordination Center lit up, without human input. A red flashing line read, Code Strategic, Initiated, Potential Hostile, Act on Active, Duty Asset, Verified, ID, Carter, J. 3 units were pinged simultaneously. The DoD Rapid Response Division, the Federal Joint Operations Office, and the Pentagon's Internal Behavioral Analysis Center. No alarms, no drawn weapons, no choppers, no shouted commands, just secure automated sequences, identity verification, encryption, and tactical routing. Each signal, from Marcus, from Jerome's embedded device, hit a system grown complacent from a lack of challenge. With the last code confirmed, the system shifted into self-drive, like blood silently rushing to a wound. On the ground, the Glock was still aimed at Jerome's head, but in the system, he was no longer just a civilian. He was now flagged as a strategic asset under threat in civilian conditions. That label didn't need a mayor's sign-off or a governor's directive. It bypassed cameras, the press, and the local jurisdiction. Internally, it triggered actions no agency could refuse, because this was coming from a command echelon above all standard structures. While Simmons shouted, his hand trembling from loss of control, in Fort Myer, just 80 miles away, a silver SUV with no plates rolled out of a back gate, no ID check required. Inside were 3 plainclothes operatives, each from a different agency: Homeland Security, Strategic Officer Protection, and Joint Force Response. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. They had already received the full incident feed within the first 5 minutes. Their job was simple now: execute protocol. At the Eastern Region Coordination Center, a backup panel displayed Civil Response Frozen, City Level Intervention Excluded. This meant any command from the local chief of police would be flagged for emergency oversight. At 2:52 p.m., the phone rang in the Millstone chief's office. The deputy picked up. A low voice, no name, no pleasantries, said, "There is a strategic priority situation in the Westbrook area. Civilian intervention must be avoided. If local forces proceed, the entire command structure will face a federal audit. No threats," but the room fell silent. No one there had ever heard federal audit in real time, because when it's used, everyone knows control has moved beyond their hands. Jerome's embedded system had finished syncing. GPS, heart rate, ambient sound, kinetic force, all sent to the analysis hub. AI flagged it. Stress level high. Resistance none. Threat level immediate. Strategic ID ignored. Even satellite feeds were rerouted and compressed for private review. No sound, no signal, no fanfare. But every data stream concluded the same. This wasn't a personal misconduct. It was a direct structural challenge. And in this machine, when someone challenges national authority without permission, they are not questioned. They are removed. 3 floors beneath the Pentagon, where the light is always a cold white and the clocks have no hands, there is a room with no nameplate, no flags, and no empty chairs. The room is only the size of 2 trucks placed side by side, yet it controls all strategic responses on U.S. territory in cases of internal conflict involving military personnel. Here there are no officers waving arms, no shouting commands, only people, more accurately biological machines, who have passed dozens of layers of screening for pressure resistance, behavioral stability under crisis, and decision-making accuracy in under 3 seconds. Each one sits in front of a triple monitor system: intelligence, response orders, and emergency protocols, wearing a headset linked to a private encrypted communication system that doesn't touch any civilian infrastructure. Everything in this room runs on one principle: no repetition, no second attempts, no triple checks. At 14:56, a line of text appeared on the central screen. Stark in deep red, no audio alert, no flashing lights. Just one plain, undeniable line: Sir Arthur, Fed threat on active duty ID, Carter J. No one asked who Carter was. The Sir Arthur tag alone indicated a strategic-level incident involving an officer on active duty with access clearance level 4.1 or higher. In other words, not a civilian, but an asset of national security. And any threat against such personnel, even from civilian law enforcement, is immediately classified as a potential internal sovereign breach. One of the on-duty officers, Rourke, around 40, clean-shaven head, expression unreadable, reached out and tapped his response panel. His eyes scanned the ID. Jerome Carter, Colonel, Joint Human Security Advisory Office, Strategic Access 4.1. Below that, a just-extracted audio clip from Jerome's personal biometric device played. The voice of the armed man, shouting clearly, "I don't care who you are. Out here, I'm the police, and I give the orders." Rourke showed no visible reaction. He didn't speed up. He just followed the exact protocol. First response code: request real-time biofeed, threat zone. 8 seconds later, the system returned a full biometric report. Heart rate is stable at 71 BPM, blood pressure at 121/76, normal neural response time, no irregular adrenaline spikes, stress level equivalent to or lower than a person at rest under controlled conditions, automatic assessment. Psychological state, stable, no panic, no loss of control, full situational awareness. A subtle pause rippled through the operations center, not from surprise, but consensus. Only those who have led in combat, trained in multi-layered crisis systems, and faced weapons with principles intact can maintain such stillness in open confrontation. For that reason, Jerome Carter was no longer just a potential victim. He wasn't someone to be saved. He had become the reference point, the benchmark the system would use to evaluate the threat before him, a measure that doesn't speak, but forces the powerful to listen. No further words were exchanged. The screen advanced. Prepare to confirm scenario, updating field response authority. And as the protocol dictates, within 120 seconds, operational control on Millstone Street would no longer belong to the police. Simmons still had the gun pointed at Jerome's head, but anyone watching could see he no longer had control over anything but his own trembling hand. His stance changed with every second, no longer that of an officer managing a situation, but of a man slowly being pulled into the abyss by his own actions. Sweat dripped from his forehead into his eyes. He blinked too late. Every breath he exhaled sounded like he was trying to convince someone, or himself, that there was still a reason not to let go. But around him, the entire space had changed color. It was no longer a quiet street with residents peeking from behind curtains. Now every window, every step, every shadow was lit, like a courtroom with no judge, no arguments. From the auto shop at the corner, a middle-aged man stepped out, phone raised but eyes no longer on the screen. locked instead on Simmons. Not fearful, but focused and quietly furious. Beside the bus stop, an Asian woman with 2 children leaned against a wall, still holding her phone steadily, recording while murmuring something in her native language. Maybe calling family, maybe reporting directly to a system she knew was active. Each person, each gaze, each camera, no longer passive. The atmosphere had shifted from fearful silence to deliberate oversight, as if the whole neighborhood had just woken from a long sleep, and Simmons was being rewritten frame by frame. He yelled, his voice hoarse, "Back off! Everyone, get back! This is a law enforcement operation!" But no one backed off. No one yielded like they had in the past. A delivery worker in an orange uniform turned, raised his camera, and zoomed in on Simmons's badge, ID number, and name tag, then quickly shared the image, added hashtags. In less than 2 minutes, from a random post, Simmons' gunpoint began trending. It was no longer a case of mistaken identity, no longer a procedural misunderstanding. It had become a public event, live-streamed from dozens of angles, analyzed frame by frame, word by word. Behind Simmons, from the second patrol car, a young officer stepped out. Uniform neat, eyes unsettled, brown-skinned, early 20s. Still green, but no longer naive. He took a few steps forward, both hands raised, before his chest like someone approaching a panicked animal. His voice was soft, not shouted. "Chief, Simmons, stop. I'll take it from here. You should step back." Every word dropped from his throat like it was breaking loose. Part advice, part prayer. But Simmons didn't turn. His grip tightened on the trigger. Sweat ran from his neck down his spine. His lips moved with fragments of nonsense. Inside his head was a swirl of authority crumbling, orders not followed, respect no longer granted, and a truth he had never prepared for. He was no longer feared. Then he screamed, no longer a cop shouting at a crowd, but a man screaming into the void of his own helplessness. The sound was dry, broken. "I'm a police officer. I have the right." But even he could no longer hear himself, because power unrecognized becomes nothing more than an echo swallowed by silence. When Simmons shoved the gun just a few inches closer to the window, just a few inches, the entire street seemed to shrink. Everyone in the area seemed to hold their breath. No more passing cars, no birds chirping on the wires. Even the wind seemed to stop. Only one thing was clearly moving: Simmons' eyes. Dilated, trembling, no longer grounded in reality. He no longer saw a soldier sitting still before him. He only saw something pulling power out of his grasp, and like all who live off one-sided authority, when stripped of submission, he resorted to the only thing left: raw violence. The young officer behind him, the only one still rational in this spiraling chaos, didn't wait another second. He yanked the radio from his shoulder, flipped the emergency switch, and shouted, "Code Red, weapon drawn without valid cause. The officer shows signs of loss of control. Requesting immediate on-site backup. Communication failed. Threat level, public safety emergency." His voice cracked at the end, not out of fear, but because he knew. He had just chosen a side, not between good and bad, but between those who still had reason and those who had crossed the legal line. A decision that could alter his career, but the only right choice. Across the street, a witness in a white shirt took a step back, brought his phone to his ear, no longer recording, but calling. Not the press. Not 911. He dialed a number most American citizens have never heard. The Department of Defense's Strategic Officer Protection Line. The voice on the other end didn't ask much, just confirmed. "He in uniform? Weapon drawn? Signs of unprovoked threat?" The man answered briefly. "Yes, they say he's Colonel Carter. A police officer has a gun on him in broad daylight." 12 seconds after the call ended, the signal entered the emergency response system. A yellow code appeared on the dashboard of the unmarked silver SUV approaching the Westbrook area. Excerpt evidence verified. Initiating protocol. From the back seat, a plainclothes agent opened a silver case. Inside were no weapons, but a portable command decryption device, an offline data vault, and a temporary signal suppressor, used to neutralize local civilian unit communications if they attempted to interfere with a situation now classified as beyond jurisdiction. No one on the street saw anything, no one heard anything, but within 3 minutes, command at the scene would no longer belong to any local authority. And still, Simmons stood in place, legs stiff, hand twitching around the gun like he was being shocked, his eyes are bloodshot, chest heaving no longer from rage but from struggling to breathe in the collapse of his own power. Part of him knew, clearly, that he had gone too far, had passed the point of no return, but the rest, the louder part, still screamed inside him like a relic of another age. I'm the police. I have authority. I represent the law. And then he roared one final line, not as a threat, but as a last cry of denial. I don't care who you are. Out here, I am the law. But this time, no one was afraid. No one looked away. No one flinched. And most importantly, no one believed those words carried legal weight anymore. Because the law, when it loses its reason to exist, doesn't get enforced. It gets rescinded. At 2:59 p.m., as every eye on Westbrook Street was locked on Simmons, a man shouting in desperation, gun hand trembling, his body no longer obeying his brain, a vehicle turned quietly onto the street from the north end. Silver gray, no license plate, no flag, no sirens. Its compact armored design didn't match any known police or military vehicle. It didn't speed. It made no unusual sound. It moved slowly, steadily, as if the surroundings parted to let it through. Its presence wasn't immediately alarming, but to those with proper training, that silence was the signal. The vehicle stopped 60 meters from the scene. No one exited. The engine cut off, no signals were given, but its arrival caused several local officers to hesitate. A crowd control supervisor began approaching it, then stopped and whispered to a colleague, "Who cleared that vehicle? This area's locked down." But no one had the answer. No one called it in. No one authorized it. No clearance from the police chief. No transit code. Because this vehicle didn't need clearance from any civilian system. It had its own jurisdiction. The door opened. 3 individuals stepped out. Not rushing, not posturing, but moving with the calm of people arriving at a long-scheduled briefing. None wore uniforms. All were in dark civilian coats, discreet earpieces and thin black bands wrapped around their left arms, a symbol only those trained in interagency coordination would recognize. Special response, system level above local jurisdiction. The lead was an older man, silver hair cropped close, eyes sharp and deep like they'd been forged by time itself. He stepped onto the sidewalk, took in the scene with a glance, said nothing, then gently touched his earpiece and spoke a single line. Westbrook Street, Millstone City. Status, takeover initiated. No one repeated it. No one needed confirmation. It was a command, and the system had been on standby since the moment Jerome Carter activated the emergency trigger. A local officer, visibly unsettled, approached and began to speak. "Excuse me, what agency are you with? This is our scene." He didn't finish. A nearby female voice cut in, calm but razor sharp. "Don't. They're not police. They don't need to be military. Interfere, and your entire chain of command will be flagged for internal systems review." She was an internal security lieutenant, trained at Quantico's Joint Force Response course. She knew, when these people show up, the best thing local law enforcement can do is nothing. On the street, the crowd started to notice. People whispered, "Who are they? FBI? No badges, no IDs. Not like any response team I've seen." But they didn't know, and didn't need to. These individuals didn't arrive to explain. They came to restore order through system authority, not verbal commands. Inside the SUV, the nav system was still active. A small screen displayed real-time data, GPS coordinates of the subject, Jerome, biometric readings, decibel levels from the threatening party, Simmons, and civilian camera feeds in the area. All of it was packaged, encrypted, and sent directly to the Pentagon's underground strategic coordination network. No warning, No countdown, and no approval from any mayor or council member was required. The third person exited the SUV silently. He was younger than the other two, but his eyes held the kind of clarity seen in those who've sat at crisis tables in Brussels or tracked insurgency heat maps over Mogadishu. In his hands, a slim tablet, no SIM card, no Wi-Fi, no apps beyond a single proprietary interface, a one-way channel to the Pentagon's strategic no passwords, no fingerprint checks. In this system, if it's online, clearance has already been confirmed from above. He didn't scan the scene like a policeman, didn't assess like military. He simply entered one command: Activation 215B/Zone, authority instantly, within 300 meters. All civilian surveillance, traffic cams, convenience store feeds, doorbell cams, synced and rerouted to the Northeast Strategic Monitoring Center. Not civilian encrypted. This was verification layer override, meaning no one, not even the state DOJ, could access footage without direct clearance from the Interagency Coordination Office. At the same time, the woman in the group, slight frame, hair tied back, nearly expressionless, stepped onto the curb, pulled a small, heat-resistant composite device from her coat, popped it open, and inserted it into what appeared to be a standard USB port on a traffic light pole, part of what looked like public infrastructure. But once the device lit up with a faint blue glow, the entire Westbrook corridor switched to a new operational state: Joint Interagency Override, Local Authority Disabled. This meant the Millstone Police Chief, the Mayor, and the elected City Council, from this point forward, none of them had no authority to issue field commands. Simmons had no idea this had happened. He was still shouting at the younger officer, who kept stepping back. Jerome, the soldier still sitting calmly in the car, hadn't said a word. He didn't need to. He knew, once the system moves in, silence becomes the ultimate display of force, and at that moment, a few residents watching via their phones noticed something strange. A blinking green dot appeared on their neighborhood cam apps. Then, abruptly, all videos went black. No errors, no lag, just gone, disconnected from the outside. At the Millstone City Command Center, a dispatch tech noticed a Westbrook anomaly. The screen flashed red, then displayed a single white message: External Override Zone, transferred to Federal Response Authority. No local input allowed. Before anyone could react, the police chief's desk phone rang. No caller ID. When he picked up, the voice on the line was low, clear, and said only one sentence: the scene had been taken over. All further instructions from your office are. He didn't respond. No one else in the room spoke. They all understood. There are moments when the system stops running to preserve appearances. It runs to preserve order at a level no business card can reach. The second armored vehicle, a cool grayish blue, unmarked and unassuming, appeared at the end of the street as if it had never left. No one saw where it came from. No siren, no screeching brakes, no traffic signal. It was simply there. Its matte, light-diffusing armor caused phone videos to capture a faint signal interference, with the image edges stretching and softening unnaturally. No manufacturer logo, no license plate, no windshield, just a solid front panel, as if it weren't made to be looked through. It didn't feel like a vehicle. It felt like an idea designed to exist without a trace. The door opened without a sound. No mechanical clunk, no footsteps. One person stepped out. Tall, upright, not imposing. His clothing wasn't military or tactical gear, just a clean, dark fabric with a high collar, tailored so precisely that any insignia it once bore had already been removed. In his left hand, a thin dossier in a static-proof nylon sleeve. Something typically reserved for interagency classified briefings. He carried no weapons, wore no hat. There was nothing to show who he represented, and that was exactly the point. He represented everything that required no introduction. He didn't approach Simmons, who was still shouting and trembling, with a weapon that had already been neutralized in everyone's mind. He walked directly toward the SUV, where Jerome Carter sat motionless, eyes forward. He didn't knock, didn't lean down, didn't rush. He simply stood there, just far enough to extend a wordless invitation anyone could understand. Jerome turned his head. His eyes didn't widen, didn't squint. They were still as a lake, but deep enough to pull anyone in if they stared too long. He recognized the man not by name, but by the timing of his arrival. Jerome opened the door. No haste, no noise. The man nodded and spoke so softly only Jerome could hear. "We're ready. No need to rush." That was all. Jerome gave a slight nod, adjusted the cuff of his shirt, and smoothed a wrinkle on his uniform shoulder. No one escorted him. No one read him his rights. No one said, "You're coming with us," because he wasn't being taken. He was returning. As Jerome stepped out of the SUV, someone in the crowd whispered they're not cuffing him. No, I think they invited him. But no one gave a definite answer. Everyone sensed something that couldn't be explained in ordinary terms. A different order had just been applied. Quieter, deeper, but no less absolute. Jerome walked through the crowd, no pushing, no weaving, no bowing. People instinctively stepped aside, parting as though he were someone they were not allowed to stop. And truthfully, in that moment, none of them wanted to. The vehicle's rear door opened. Jerome got in. The man followed without another word. The door closed, soft as a breath. There was no engine roar. Yet, seconds later, the vehicle was gone. No one saw it back up. No one saw it turn. It simply no longer belonged to this place. Simmons stood frozen, watching Jerome leave uncuffed. He didn't understand. He couldn't accept it. His face flushed, not only from rage, but from a fear crawling backward up his throat, choking him. He shouted again, but the force in his voice was gone. "Why aren't you arresting him? He disobeyed an order. I'm the law here. This is my jurisdiction." He turned to the young officer and pointed at the vanished vehicle. "You saw that. They just let a suspect go. You saw it, didn't you?" But the young officer said nothing. He bowed his head, not to Simmons, but because it was now undeniable. Simmons was no longer someone who required an answer. And at that moment, 2 of the 3 plainclothes agents approached, not rushing, unarmed, without warrants. The man in front, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, close-cropped hair. The woman behind him, pale-skinned, slight, wearing thin gloves. They didn't look at Simmons like a colleague losing control. They looked at him like a behavioral anomaly that had been flagged and now needed to be removed. The man pulled from his inner pocket a small rectangular device, smooth, single button, with a red LED at the top edge. He raised it to Simmons's eye level. Strategic Behavior Verification Device, gray override protocol. His voice wasn't loud, yet everyone nearby heard it clearly, as if the system itself had amplified just the right frequency for that sentence to enter the mind without repetition. The woman followed, voice neutral, not cold, not soft. "You've been classified as no longer behaviorally secure. Field control transfer is now in effect. Your command authority at this scene is terminated. No confirmation from your agency is required." No one shouted, "Arrest him." No handcuffs. No one yanked Simmons's gun. They didn't need to. His authority had already been nullified from within the system. The young officer who had earlier tried to reason with Simmons now quietly stepped forward. Calmly, without threat, he unlatched Simmons's holster and removed the Glock. One fluid motion. He set it on the patrol car's hood, engaged the safety, then stepped back. No one patted Simmons on the back. No one said, "Try to calm down." He remained where he stood, not handcuffed, but no longer permitted to move. In strategic classification, that condition is defined as neutralized entity no longer holds valid influence over the scene. Simmons didn't know what to do. He looked around. No one met his eyes as a fellow officer. No more nods of silent solidarity. No eyes waiting for orders. Only unfamiliar stares, as if he were the only one unaware that a verdict had already been executed without a courtroom. His throat burned. His lips foamed slightly from rage turned inward. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The system had stripped him of even the ability to define who he was. A child in the crowd turned to ask his mother, "Is that man getting arrested?" The mother looked at her son, then turned away. gently shaking her head. Not because she didn't know, but how could she explain? Police bring order to people, but not every officer is good in the way we hope. That one, sweetheart, might be one of the bad ones. 3:08 p.m. On the top floor of the Richmond State Administration Building, the office of the Governor of Virginia was quieter than usual. No reporters, no federal officials are waiting for a meeting. Only a cluster of domestic security advisors is discussing upgrades to the D.C. border defense lines, following a wave of reports about illegal weapons flow. The bulletproof windows were shut, curtains closed. The air conditioning hummed steadily, like a hospital respirator keeping a critical patient stable. Into that stillness, a single sound broke through. Beep! Not a personal phone, not the media hotline. It came from a separate device, matte black, heavy, screenless, lightless, with just one button and a built-in speaker. A dual encrypted line known to fewer than 10 people in the entire state executive network, and among them only the governor had the authority to pick it up. Governor McClellan looked up. No one moved. Every eye was fixed on the desk. No one asked, "Are you going to answer that?" Because everyone knew. When that device makes a sound, all meetings, plans, and draft legislation come to a halt, not because someone says so, but because real power doesn't debate. She picked up. No questions, no greetings, no name. The voice on the other end didn't introduce itself either. A male voice, neither high nor low, not threatening, not friendly, but each word carried the weight of something stamped deep within an agency even the FBI couldn't enter without clearance. We just averted a national-level incident. At Millstone, no response required from the state. All on-site action has followed Gray protocol. Press communication will be managed by the Department of Defense. Request that your offices make no public comments. No excess, no urgency, no fear. Every word sounded like it had already been signed, needing only to be read aloud to become reality. The call ended in less than 30 seconds, no tone, no goodbye. And when she set the receiver down, the room was as silent as when it started. But the atmosphere had changed. It felt as if an invisible force had walked through the room, brushed past every symbol of political power, and left behind a warning that didn't need to be written. A senior advisor opened his mouth. What just happened? Then thought better of it. Because everyone understood. If the head of the state had just received a call she wasn't allowed to question, then no one else had the right to demand answers. Not because they were weak, but because in this system, some layers of authority don't report. They just call. McClellan said nothing. She opened her laptop and typed a single line in the internal chat with her chief of staff. Suspend all internal media activity related to the Westbrook area until further notice from the federal side. Then she sat still, not waiting for developments, but recalling a truth longtime politicians dread confronting. Some days, you don't govern a state. You hold a seat for a higher power and hope it doesn't come back to ask why you ever thought you were in charge. 3 minutes after hanging up, Governor McClellan still hadn't spoken. No notes, no orders, no eye contact. She remained silent, as if waiting for another signal, or recalculating the entire landscape of power in her head. The advisory team stayed motionless, eyes lowered to collars. No one dared look toward the desk. The door opened. The communications aide entered, tablet in hand. "Ma'am, a video from Millstone is going viral. Footage of a white officer pointing a gun at a uniformed man. Over 600,000 views. Hashtags Simmons gunpoint and the Colonel are trending on Twitter in under an hour." McClellan wasn't surprised. She turned her chair to face the window and said without looking back, "No comment, no confirmation, no denial. Forward all press requests to the Department of Defense and tell the Chief of Staff cancel this afternoon's meeting with the police union reps." That last line caused a ripple in the room, but no one responded because they all knew some decisions aren't for discussion, they're for execution before anyone asks why. Down on the street, the media began arriving. A few locals near the scene tried to speak out, but suddenly, live broadcasts experienced an 8-second delay, a soft filter, not jarring. New accounts with blue checks started posting messages urging people to wait for verification from official sources. No one issued censorship orders. No one blocked content. But the data flow began adjusting on its own, as if the algorithm sensed something unfolding beyond standard parameters. In major newsrooms, senior editors sent a single sentence to their field teams: "Don't touch Millstone. Wait for a defense signal." No explanations, no questions, because they knew some stories are handled so they don't have to be told. Back in Richmond, Governor McClellan stood up. She didn't say another word to her team, but in her mind surfaced a thought no governor wants to admit. Today, my state experienced an institutional crisis, and I am not allowed to name it. She stepped out the door and called back, "Suspend all internal updates. From now on, we don't control the narrative, we control the silence." A cold line, but a true one, because she knew silence is the last thing holding the surface of the lake together. That's how a large system calms a storm. Not with statements, not with briefings, not with a press secretary by the mic. It calms with a deliberate retreat, by making sure everyone understands that some storms are not meant to be named. And sometimes the strength of a system isn't in winning, it's in knowing when to make an entire nation go silent at once. Just as the incident in Westbrook seemed to be over, Jerome Carter's vehicle had left, and Simmons had been neutralized on site. Elsewhere, over 150 kilometers from the scene, a silent process began. No sirens, no breaking news, but within 40 minutes, all visual data from the area labeled a strategic contact point had been funneled into a signal processing system buried beneath Fort Belvoir. Every camera, from the body cams on local officers, the overhead security cam at the post office, convenience store surveillance, to incomplete live streams on TikTok and Facebook, was captured and synchronized. No court order, no extraction email, no official memo. Only one thing was required: confirmation that Code Gray had been activated. From that moment, Millstone, at least in terms of data, ceased to be a civilian town. It became a strategic surveillance zone, where every pixel turned into unarguable evidence. The team in charge was the Image Analysis Unit of the Interagency Analysis Bureau, a group that never appears at press briefings, but is always present when the system needs conclusions for events that cannot be disclosed. In a windowless room, they sat before dozens of synchronized monitors, each person responsible for a different time layer, from the moment Jerome's vehicle stopped, to the second the gun was drawn, to each twitch of Simmons' eyes, then to the crowd's reaction. They didn't judge right or wrong. They didn't edit for broadcast. They flagged only three things. 1, the exact moment the gun was drawn. 2, the moment the military ID was shown. And 3, the instant Simmons lost neurological control. A convenience store awning camera at an unnoticed angle happened to capture Jerome's face close up as he said, "I know my rights." It wasn't a punchline. It wasn't a declaration. But his eyes, calm, direct, unflinching, made the entire analysis team pause for a few seconds. Not out of surprise, but because they knew that footage would never be released publicly. Instead, it would be archived as internal training material within the on-site response system rehabilitation category. It wasn't just images. Audio was processed using deep spectrum noise filtering protocols. Hyperdirectional microphones, originally installed along traffic routes for flow management, were reactivated. Every yell, command, slow engine hum, even Simmons' footsteps on the sidewalk were analyzed to determine controlled intensity, or more precisely, the degree of psychological collapse while armed. The final seconds before Jerome exited the vehicle, when he said nothing but looked straight at the lead officer's recording lens, were flagged by the specialists as proactive composure, preservation under armed threat. That level of assessment is rarely assigned to a subject not in active uniform, because typically civilians don't stay calm enough for the system to learn from them. Once the processing was complete, none of the data was sent to the FBI, state court, or internal affairs. It was encrypted and transferred to the Department of Defense's Direct Contact Behavior Monitoring Unit. used solely to adjust federal officer training and recalibrate responses in situations showing signs of systemic fracture under field pressure. Within that archive, the Millstone footage wasn't stored under the name Simmons, nor under Jerome Carter. It was tagged as G12.07X strategic_contact. The file contained no emotion, no description of blackmail, no verdict like officer misconduct, only timestamps, signals, and consequences. Because the system doesn't need to know who was right, the system just needs to relearn one thing. Sometimes, the person it didn't train is the only one who holds the standard. At the same time, the Millstone footage was being processed deep under Fort Belvoir. A small group from the Department of Justice gathered in Room 11B, a restricted access administrative zone used exclusively for handling conflicts between civilian law enforcement and military personnel. No official summons, no invitations. Yet everyone who needed to be there knew the time, the room, and their seat. It's the kind of reflex found only in systems where the most critical meetings leave behind no calendar trace, no minutes, no subject line, no email permissions. Representing the Department of Justice were 4 people, 3 senior attorneys and a behavioral systems analyst. The military sent only 2, a senior advisor from the Army Chief of Staff's office and a human rights strategist who once served with Jerome Carter's unit in 2006. Both were in civilian clothes, no name tags, no credentials. The meeting began with a subjectless sentence. If it hadn't been Carter today, this would have ended differently. No one objected. No one felt the need to verify, because silence had become the only shared language between these 2 branches of power, one guarding the law, the other guarding the law's survival. A young legal aide at the end of the table, the only one who had never attended a meeting like this, spoke up. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted his glass of water, but his voice tried to stay composed. Suppose he hadn't been a colonel. What if it had been a civilian in old fatigues? A reservist? A veteran never flagged as strategic. It wasn't a naive question. It was a dangerous one because it touched the very core of what everyone was avoiding. The current system has no capacity to protect those not on the priority list, even if they once bled for that system. The military representative didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at the screen where the Millstone temporary surveillance map was displayed. After a few seconds, he spoke slowly. That's why armed conduct by civilian police must fall under strategic monitoring, even in peacetime. One of the 3 DOJ attorneys furrowed his brow, ready to respond, but fell silent. Not because he lacked an argument, but because he knew any resistance right now would be remembered as obstruction to national stability. No one slammed the table. No one shouted. There was no word like mandatory, but by the end of the meeting, a red line of text appeared on the internal digital board. Proposal: to establish an interagency response protocol, independent of local authority directives, in incidents involving police use of weapons near strategic personnel or sensitive zones. That line was not a command, but everyone understood. From today on, the system would begin watching those who once believed they had the right to watch everyone else. The meeting room sat deep within the Washington Navy Yard complex. No signage, no room booking, not listed on any internal security map. The door was made of composite steel, coated in a rough gray paint like aged concrete, so that anyone who happened to pass by wouldn't recognize it as an entryway. Inside, there were no logos, no flags, no agency names printed anywhere. Just a long table, 12 chairs, and a low-frequency recording system that couldn't be activated without dual code verification from 2 separate departments. Jerome entered without an escort. The door closed silently behind him. 11 others were already seated. Some wore civilian attire, some wore unmarked military fatigues. No one introduced themselves. No ranks were stated. Only one person, a representative from the Interagency Response Office, nodded and said just 2 words: "Have a seat." Jerome didn't scan the room, didn't size anyone up. He pulled out a chair, sat down, placed his hands lightly on the table, back straight, eyes forward, not looking at any one person, but into the void the system had long refused to face. The room was thick with atmosphere, but not tense, more like the moment before exploratory surgery. No shouting, no banging of fists, but everyone knew that silence left unchecked would soon become toxic. No one asked him how he felt. No one apologized. There was no testimony. The session began with a flat, emotionless statement. "Mr. Carter, we need your assistance in assessing the risk of recurrence for incidents like Westbrook from a strategic standpoint." No one mentioned Simmons. No one used the phrase local police. Words like abuse of power, discrimination, and violation were absent because here they didn't speak in accusations. They spoke in truths the system could no longer pretend not to see. Jerome nodded slowly. He didn't pull out documents, didn't open a laptop. He simply spoke, his voice low and steady, like gravel rolling in a deep well. Millstone isn't an exception, it's a result, a product of accumulation, from years of the system lying to itself with ethics checklists instead of asking the real question: who holds the gun? And why were they never taught to see the human in front of them as anything but a threat? No one interrupted. One person tapped a finger lightly on the table, as if checking the room's pulse. Another lowered their head and scribbled something quickly, but no one argued, because everyone in the room knew he wasn't recounting an incident. He was dissecting a foundation built wrong from the start. Silence held for nearly 2 minutes after Jerome finished his first remarks. No one debated. No one affirmed. In strategic politics, such silence isn't agreement. It's proof the words just spoken carried too much weight for any procedural response not to seem absurd. A soldier who had once commanded in Mosul, who had earned the Medal of Freedom but chose to remain a technical advisor rather than chase promotion, had just looked the system in the face and said, "You don't know who's holding the gun." And in this room, with no nameplates, no cameras, no transcripts, that statement could not be erased. The first to respond was a woman from the Interagency Legal Conduct Center. She had taken no notes during the meeting, arms folded, watching Jerome since he arrived. Now she leaned slightly forward, tilted her head, and asked a question, not hostile, but far from neutral. "If you're right that the system failed by allowing someone like Simmons to carry a weapon, then why did you stay? Why didn't you speak out earlier? Why did it take becoming the victim for you to make them listen?" It wasn't a scripted question. It wasn't in the briefing notes. It wasn't recommended in any guidance prepared for the meeting, but it was asked. And the room held its breath, because it was the kind of question anyone inside a system of power has always wanted to ask the one who stayed silent too long. Jerome didn't frown, didn't react. He took a breath and answered in a voice that wasn't meant to defend himself, but to seal what had long remained unspoken. "I was never silent. I just didn't speak in the ways you're used to hearing. I wrote reports. I flagged warnings. I submitted proposals for retraining programs. I didn't call the press. I didn't live stream, because I believed if this system still had a shred of conscience, it would know how to read its own internal alerts. I was wrong about that." That last line caused the entire room to flinch, not because he admitted fault, but because he had just exposed the most dangerous truth. You don't need to commit evil to rot a system. You only need to believe, wrongly, that it can heal itself. One officer from the Internal Security Office looked down at his file as if reading something never printed. A military representative tapped his fingers against a folder, but didn't turn the page. Jerome continued, "You ask why I didn't speak up sooner? I ask how many others did, but didn't have the rank of colonel, didn't have a medal badge, didn't have a service record in your archives? And when they had guns pointed at them, were you there? How many shouted in desperation and were labeled resistant by the system? How many filed complaints only for those forms to sit at the bottom of a drawer until someone died? They spoke. You just didn't listen, because your ears only turn on when someone survives a nationally televised incident. This time, no one sat up straight, not out of offense, but because the posture of neutrality was no longer possible. The room, once designed to protect anonymity and precision, had become the first space in the system to admit truth may come not from the loud, the unruly, or the unlawful, but from the one who stood still and had a gun put to their head. Jerome remained seated, hands folded in front of him. He wasn't seeking to win. He wasn't asking for a reaction. But in the eyes of every person present, for the first time, there was something they couldn't hide. They no longer saw him as a victim saved, but as a witness the system never dared to face. Before the name Simmons became a viral trigger of outrage on social media, before the people of Millstone collectively condemned him as the man who pointed a gun at a colonel, there was a not-so-distant time when he had once been called the hope of the next generation patrol force. Born in a small Midwestern town, Simmons grew up in a single-parent working-class home, his mother a nurse, his father gone since he was 5. In a place where becoming an officer was a ticket out of invisibility, he chose the police path with a naive belief to have authority meant to have worth. At 21, after losing a football scholarship due to a ligament injury, he enrolled in the Virginia State Law Enforcement Academy, not out of a passion for public service, but because he wanted to be on the side that gave orders, not took them. From his first year, Simmons was labeled a standout candidate, not for his intelligence, not for tactical awareness, but for two qualities the system quietly prizes, yet rarely admits: an imposing physical presence that could dominate through appearance alone, and a total, unquestioning obedience to authority. During his 3 years at the academy, he never once challenged an instructor, never asked for a breakdown of any simulated scenario. He didn't ask questions, not out of respect, but because he never thought he needed to. To Simmons, the law was something to enforce, not to understand, and the less an enforcer questioned, the more at ease the system felt. That's why Simmons was fast-tracked to frontline duty ahead of his peers. In a live-fire simulation, he shot a mock target 0.9 seconds after identifying a potential threat. He was rated highly reactive, but no one asked how he decided who looked threatening. In the Operational Stress Management module, he scored top marks, not for composure, but for his ability to physically dominate others. No one taught him that authority isn't the same as force. No one taught him that a silent black man isn't a threat. No one taught him there are situations where drawing a weapon isn't just unnecessary, it's unacceptable, even when you have the right. After graduation, Simmons was assigned to a community interaction patrol unit, typically used for close commanded situations. He wasn't friendly, but he was effective, not disruptive, but always in control, simply because people avoided him. They feared his silence, his unreadable eyes, the way he issued commands without context, and the way he could escort someone off the street just by standing too close. The system recorded no misconduct in Simmons's file because he never left a bruise. He only left a feeling, and feelings don't go into reports. Once, an older lieutenant took him aside. "You should learn to take a step back when people don't understand you. Your order may be correct, but it's not the order they fear. It's you." Simmons didn't respond. He nodded, saluted, and the next day resumed his patrols. Same stare, same stride, chest forward as if every citizen encounter was an ID check in disguise. He wasn't a bad man, but he was trained wrong, and worse, no one corrected him, because in a system that prioritizes training scores and situation control speed, Simmons always ranked near the top. By his 6th year, he was reassigned to Millstone, a small city considered a real-world test for hardened officers. Diverse population, frequent low-level confrontations, a high appeal rate on citations, but also a place where officer conduct was loosely monitored. And Simmons, equipped with everything labeled qualified, walked into that gray zone where a long stare, a car parked 3 minutes too long, or a civilian who didn't rush to produce documents could make him feel justified in saying, "I have the right to stop you because I feel I should." The problem was, no one argued with him, so he believed he was right, until the day Jerome Carter looked him in the eyes and didn't flinch. After arriving in Millstone, Simmons found the perfect environment for his skewed psychology to thrive. A small city with weak oversight, a population with low trust in complaint systems, and incidents quietly handled internally. He didn't need violence to be intimidating. He just needed that stare, a gaze without emotion, without dialogue, as if the person in front of him was not a citizen, but a problem to correct through authority. Westbrook residents later recalled, Simmons didn't shout or hit, but when he showed up, people stepped back. He wasn't a patrolling officer, he was a presence that carried a silent threat. A woman once reported being pulled over for having a suspicious expression while driving slowly in a residential zone. A teenage boy was detained simply for wearing a hoodie and looking at the patrol car for too long. No lawsuits were filed. No proof existed, but Simmons's violation log thickened, not from arresting real offenders, but from escalating minor interactions into confrontations that should have ended with a conversation. In staff meetings, Simmons rarely spoke. When asked, he always answered by the book. He memorized protocols. He knew every line in the procedural manual. And that's what made him dangerous. He knew the rules well enough to never cross a disciplinary line while exploiting every gray area in between. No one could write him up. No one could pin misconduct, and in the system, no one wanted to go after an officer with a clean legal record. So, year after year, he endured, living proof of an officer who wasn't unlawful but fundamentally misaligned with the law's purpose. When Jerome Carter declined to produce his documents, Simmons didn't respond like a trained officer, maintaining calm. He didn't ask why. He didn't recheck the reason for the stop. He simply stared into the eyes of a man who didn't lower his gaze, and in Simmons's mind, that silent defiance meant a loss of control, and he couldn't accept that, because Simmons wasn't programmed to process legal non-compliance. He was trained only to suppress, and to suppress quickly. The moment he drew his weapon, the situation crossed the line from procedural to psychological. He wasn't enforcing the law. He was reclaiming the role he felt slipping away. In his mind, there was no decorated soldier, no human rights, no moral dilemma. Only one code, repeated like a hard-wired loop. I have authority. I am protected. I must make the subject submit. From that moment, every possible outcome pointed toward one action, pulling the trigger. What he didn't expect was that the man didn't flinch. And when Jerome didn't lower his head, didn't beg, didn't bark back, the system Simmons believed was on his side began to move, but not in his direction. Simmons didn't know what the cameras caught, didn't know which live streams had gone up. He only knew he was now surrounded by eyes that no longer feared him, and then the people in plain clothes arrived. No shouting, no commands, but when they told him to lower the weapon, for the first time, Simmons didn't know who he was. He was no longer the trained enforcer, no longer Officer Simmons, no longer part of the rapid response team. He was just a man with a weapon, out of control, revealing a truth the system had long refused to confront. Simmons didn't become a villain through a single act. He became one through hundreds of small choices created, legitimized, and left uncorrected. And in a system that cannot monitor its own enforcers, a man like Simmons is not a mistake, he is an outcome. Immediately following the Westbrook incident, the entire command floor of the Millstone Police Department was summoned for an emergency meeting. No memo, no public notice. The order came through internal phones, and each officer was called individually. Within less than an hour, the third-floor briefing room was filled to capacity. No jokes, no coffee like usual. No one asked, is the official video out yet? Because everyone already knew. This was no longer an internal matter. The media was erupting. But what truly silenced the room was the fact that no one at the department was authorized to speak, and the only person who could was seated at the head of the table, pale and with a slight tremble in his hands. Police Chief Raymond Hill. Hill didn't speak right away. He flipped through the file in front of him, opened it, closed it, flipped another page. No one could tell if he was actually reading. Maybe he just needed something to do with his hands, because his mind was in chaos. This wasn't the first time an officer under his command had faced complaints. It wasn't the first time the media had zeroed in on the force. But this was the first time control of a crime scene had been seized by a system not on his level but far above. So high, He didn't even know which law to invoke. Simmons had been taken over on site. No internal procedure, no required sign-off. And what hit Hill hardest wasn't that Simmons was wrong, but that someone had entered his field, stopped his game mid-slack, without asking. "We need to re-examine our role," he said, voice dry and raspy like burning paper. When he repeated the sentence a third time, a lieutenant finally spoke up. "Sir, do we have the right to file a federal complaint?" That was clearly an overstep without going through the governor. Hill didn't answer right away. He folded the file shut, placed it on the table, and replied, "No response is authorized until the Department of Defense completes its assessment. We can't stop anything right now." The room fell as silent as if the AC had been shut off. A senior captain leaned back, eyes drifting toward the ceiling, silently wondering, if we can't stop, can't respond, can't investigate, are we still an enforcement agency at all? For many in the room, this was the first time they had ever felt so small. The privileges they had come to take for granted, the right to access, to question, to act on judgment, were now suspended. No official suspension notice, but clearly it was a quiet freeze. What had just happened meant Millstone was no longer under tactical autonomy. It had been placed under strategic monitoring. Hill knew this, but he couldn't say it out loud without sounding like he was admitting defeat. So instead he said, "Effective immediately, all field-level responses must go through a 3-step preview. Even in cases we used to resolve in 5 minutes." Eyes around the room began to shift. Not out of defiance, but because for the first time they understood a bullet that hadn't been fired could still destroy a system, if that bullet was in the hands of someone they had trusted as well-trained. And what was even more terrifying was the realization that the well-trained officer was a product of everything they had once proudly called tough, efficient, rapid response policing. At the back of the room, where the lights didn't shine directly and questions were never voiced aloud, sat the newer officers, uniforms still crisp, name tags not yet scratched, and ideals still pinned proudly to their chests. They sat upright, silent, not interrupting, not because of discipline, but because of an unease their training manuals had never prepared them for. Most of them were recruited after 2015, during the shift toward urban combat readiness, with training focused on preempting threats before they spread. In drills, they practiced deciding within 2 seconds and were told to distinguish fake weapons from real ones by reading someone's eyes. But no one had ever asked them something simple. If the person in front of you does nothing threatening, but you still feel fear, whose fault is that? Someone whispered, "What if the person with the gun pointed at him hadn't been a military colonel?" Another quietly replied, sharp but soft, "If it were a civilian, no one would have made it in time." The exchange was brief, not bitter, but it chilled the room. Because it wasn't just about yesterday's incident. It was about every time the car never came. The camera wasn't there, and the victim's name wasn't big enough to force the system to look up. A young lieutenant stared at his phone screen, reading the Defense Department's short-pressed note. No public directive, incident managed under interagency protocol. He remembered his first academy briefing. The instructor had said, "Your duty as an officer is to preserve order," but no one had taught them the difference between order and enforced silence. No one had warned them that sometimes the system itself might be the threat, and the person in uniform its misused instrument. The meeting ended with a single email. Subject line, "Temporary adjustment to subject engagement protocol." The content was short. It simply instructed, "Do not engage at close range without full ID confirmation and signs of immediate threat." But no one asked what ID really meant. A name, a job, a badge, or the right to stay alive without having to prove you deserve it, one sergeant murmured as he stood. "I'm not sure if that man was saved because he's a colonel or because he was so calm it scared them." No one responded, but the thought lingered in everyone's mind, like a reminder that the duty they believed they were upholding might not be protection anymore. As they left the briefing room, the hallways were still lit. Colleagues still nodded to each other, but their footsteps were heavier. No one knew exactly what came next. They only knew this. From now on, every time they reached toward their holsters, it wouldn't just be suspicion in the eyes across from them. There would also be scrutiny from a different system, higher than theirs, and this time it wouldn't be on their side by default. 2 days after the Westbrook incident, when no one publicly mentioned his name anymore and the media had shifted to more manageable topics, Simmons received a piece of paper from an unknown source. No header, no national seal, no words like summons or pursuant to article, just a plain white sheet with a single line, typed in evenly spaced Courier New font, centered on the page. Required to appear at the Civil Military Interagency Cooperation Unit, Arlington Administrative Sector, Room 4C, at 7:45 tomorrow morning. Do not bring weapons. No signature. No sender. No verifiable source. At the bottom, a small QR code, the only modern touch. When Simmons scanned it using the department's internal device, the screen displayed verified mandatory appearance. No response required. Simmons set the device down. He brushed his fingers along the page's edge, as if searching for hidden print or texture. There was none. It wasn't thick nor thin. No creases, no dust. As if it hadn't been sent, it had simply appeared where he would find it. And Simmons, with nearly 10 years in the force, numerous complaint hearings, dozens of written reports, and conversations with 3 different lawyers to protect himself, now had no idea why he was being summoned, by whom, or under what law. He brought the paper to his administrative captain. "What is this?" he asked. The captain scanned the QR code, saw the verification, and then calmly placed the paper back on the desk. He didn't look at Simmons, he just said, "I don't know, but if it's from Interagency Command, you should go." Simmons stood still. His chest rose and fell. Dozens of theories circled in his mind, but none gave him control. This didn't feel like internal affairs. It didn't feel like a routine performance review. It wasn't a court summons. It was something outside the bounds of anything he'd encountered. That evening, Simmons didn't eat, didn't turn on the TV, didn't contact anyone. He sat on the bed, staring at the paper, as if it were a foreign object bearing symbols from a world he didn't belong to, a world that didn't need to call or threaten. It only needed to write one sentence, and those who understood, understood. If you didn't show up, there was no return. At 7:00 a.m. the next morning, Simmons drove toward Arlington. No uniform, no badge. He wore his duty-issued watch more from instinct than conviction, but for the first time he wasn't sure he was still part of the force. When the door to Room 4C opened, no nameplate, no greeting, no check-in, Simmons realized every procedure he had ever followed no longer applied. Room 4C resembled no place he had ever entered. No dark wood paneling, no placards, just a cold, white light. A matte-finished metal table and 4 individuals, each seated at a corner, as if they had been waiting long before he arrived. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Not a lock, but a confirmation. You're now in a space no one outside can interfere with. No one welcomed him. No one gestured toward a seat. But Simmons knew where to sit. He didn't speak, not out of fear alone, but because he sensed that anything excessive would be remembered, not by recording, but by the gaze of the 4th person. Silent, unmoving, unblinking. That gaze wasn't aggressive, but it left no space for false confidence. The first to speak was the representative from the Department of Justice. She didn't ask if he wanted a lawyer. She didn't ask if he consented to speak. She simply stated, "We need to verify your response capacity under conditions of uncontrolled pressure." Then came the questions. Short, precise, emotionless. Why did you draw your weapon with no visible threat? Did you confirm the subject's identity? Why did you approach the driver's window instead of maintaining a defensive distance? Were you aware the subject was a protected strategic officer? Simmons hesitated, not because he lacked a defense, but because all the justifications that once helped him skirt state-level discipline now worked against him. Claims like, "I felt threatened," and "he wasn't cooperative," were swiftly dismantled by one quiet line from the military side. The problem isn't your reflex. The problem is that you failed to control the authority you were given. The session lasted over an hour. No raised voices, no charges filed. But the air was dense. As if everyone already understood, Simmons would not return to his previous role, even if no one said it aloud. When the files were closed, the administrative coordinator stated a final sentence, not loud, not theatrical, but deeply final. You are not being prosecuted under state law, but your actions are considered a threat to strategic military personnel. That places you under interagency jurisdiction, outside state authority. Simmons said nothing, but inside his mind unfamiliar terms began to echo. Strategic personnel, interagency response, outside jurisdiction. He didn't understand them all, but he understood this. For the first time, his badge hadn't saved him. It had put him in a zone where civil law could no longer shield him. When he exited the room, the door made no sound, but inside, a sound rang clearly. Everything he had once believed to be power had become evidence, and this time, no one stood with him. No one. That morning, when Simmons returned home from an unnamed debriefing in Arlington, he hadn't even reached the top step of his porch before his heart sank. 2 unmarked cars were parked diagonally at the corner. Casually, it seemed, but the lenses were on, phones were recording, and the questions were already prepared. Freelance reporters, independent streamers, and anonymous short video accounts didn't need permits or lighting rigs. They only needed to stand still and wait for the man who had once hidden behind silence to step out from his final layer of protection. Did you know he was military? Do you feel abandoned by your superiors? Do you plan to apologize? Simmons said nothing. He didn't meet their eyes, but that silence became the default answer, as if his hesitation confirmed the public's need for someone to blame. No criminal charges were announced, but Simmons and his family understood. The harshest court is the one that needs no judge. His wife, a night shift nurse at the city hospital, was summoned to HR twice in 3 days. She wasn't fired, but her schedule kept changing at the last minute. Her shifts were reassigned without notice. Colleagues stopped speaking casually. A young nurse whispered behind her back, "Don't you think it's awkward if black patients find out who your husband is?" The words didn't need to be loud, they only needed to exist to make someone understand. No one escapes the bloodstain the public imagines for them. Simmons's son, just 13, was pulled out of school after the footage of his father pointing a gun at an unresisting black man went viral. During recess, a classmate asked in front of the entire room, "Is your dad going to shoot anyone else?" The boy didn't fight, he just stood still, then ran into the bathroom and didn't come out for the rest of the period. When the teacher found him, he said only one thing, "I don't want people to think I'm like my dad." That sentence, like a reversed blade, cut deeper into Simmons than any interrogation ever could. No one sued Simmons. No one prosecuted his wife. No one charged his son. But the terrifying truth was, all 3 were punished, simply for having once lived under the same roof. The system gave no orders to isolate them. It simply stayed silent. And in that silence, the crowd had room to do the rest. Shun, mock, fabricate a villain out of shadows no one had confirmed, and Simmons, once used to giving orders, could no longer protect his family from something harsher than the law. Contempt streamed frame by frame. There were no sirens, no official memos tacked to department walls, but everyone inside Millstone PD knew Simmons was no longer one of them. His name vanished from the duty roster. His account was silently deactivated from the case file system. Every trace was removed from the intranet. A single department-wide email was sent out, cold and clipped. Officer Simmons is no longer assigned to patrol operations. All inquiries to be directed through interagency legal. No one said his name at lunch. No one asked how's he holding up. The name Simmons, once common in the rapid response unit, became a silence in itself, not because he was convicted, but because he was no longer permitted to be called colleague. Simmons didn't wait to be rescued. He hired a lawyer, someone who'd previously handled sensitive internal investigations for local departments. But as soon as his case file was submitted, The attorney received an anonymous reply. Your client is no longer under municipal administrative jurisdiction. The matter falls under the authority of the Interagency Security Response Commission. The lawyer didn't understand, neither did Simmons, but just hours later they were invited to a preliminary exchange with a civilian-dressed representative from the Department of Defense. No name, no badge, just a calm reading of the incident. Like one recites casualty lists after battle. At 1454, you drew a firearm in a residential zone, directly aiming at a high-level military personnel who was non-aggressive and had clearly identified himself. Simmons interrupted. I didn't know who he was. The official didn't argue. He raised an eyebrow, then said, We don't evaluate you based on what you knew. We evaluate you based on what you failed to do. Verify. Simmons repeated a defense that had once worked in prior hearings. I lost control. It was reflex. I saw a threat. This time, the official didn't nod, didn't take notes, just said, Exactly. And because you lost control, you can no longer carry a weapon. For Simmons, that wasn't just a rejection. It was the final line of his career. Since the first day at the academy, he had believed reflex was strength. That quick judgment was the modern cop's edge. The faster hand controlled the situation. But today, for the first time, a higher system, quieter, colder, and immune to excuses, told him, reflex does not replace recognition. After the meeting, Simmons's lawyer asked one of the military officials privately, Is there any way he can return to service? The response came without pause. We do not reinstate individuals who have drawn weapons on strategic personnel, even if they apologize, even if they explain. Because if we allow that, it means we accept having people who can't tell the difference between a threat and an ally. From that day on, Simmons was barred from carrying a gun, barred from entering any military facility, barred from coming near any active duty incident involving armed forces. No indictment, no official ruling to appeal, because in the Interagency Security Response System, once trust is lost, every ounce of prior authority becomes evidence. No spokesperson, no press release, no internal memo or polished LinkedIn post like many of his peers. One quiet morning in a small back room of a rented apartment in Navy Hill, Jerome Carter placed a stack of blank paper on the table, picked up an old black ink pen, and began to write. His handwriting was steady, slightly slanted, and purposeful, like the way he used to write field orders during wartime. No edits, no rewrites. He wrote exactly 2 pages, nothing more, nothing less, and didn't read it back. This wasn't a letter to plead or complain. It was a message, calm, cold, and meant to unsettle. Jerome knew those working in military and police academies didn't need a sermon. They needed to be forced to confront what they had been ignoring, that what happened in Westbrook wasn't an anomaly, but a foreseeable outcome of training people to carry weapons without teaching them understanding. He titled nothing. He included no insignia. The first line was handwritten. I am not writing this letter because I was harmed. I'm writing because too many others were, and no one listened until someone like me nearly died. Then came a paragraph later, reposted in internal message boards at no fewer than 7 academies. I don't need you to fear me. I need you to understand what almost happened. He didn't describe the event, didn't name Simmons, didn't mention rank or chain of command. He simply asked questions, directed squarely at the people training new officers. Who taught them that instinct should override judgment? Why do they draw their weapon when the man in front of them has done nothing wrong? Are we training people to carry weapons or to carry reasons to use them? The letter was mailed through regular post, no red stamp, no encryption, but each envelope was addressed personally to the head of training or dean of every academy. It wasn't for the press, it wasn't made public, but no one who received it dared throw it away, because the handwriting carried a weight that everyone who had ever worn a uniform could recognize. This letter wasn't written to request, it was written to warn. Soon after, the letter began quietly circulating. At 3 state police academies, it was reprinted and posted in instructor break rooms. Some cadets took photos and shared them in private forums, not because they completely agreed, but because they couldn't fully dismiss it either. No one rewrote the curriculum. But instructors began asking themselves at least once, has the question, When are you allowed to draw your weapon? Ever been taught alongside? And when are you not? Jerome wasn't accusing. He didn't condemn. He didn't use words like irresponsible or systemic failure. He didn't attack the system. But that restraint gave his words more weight than any formal indictment. In the second half of the letter, he didn't recount events. He posed more questions that couldn't be easily avoided. Do you ever teach your cadets to tell the difference between someone silent from fear and someone silent because they have reason to stand firm? When an officer draws their weapon within 3 seconds, who is responsible, the officer or the one who taught them that quick reaction equals survival? Are we training officers to manage situations or to impose their own definitions of control onto others? There were no easy answers, and Jerome knew that, but he didn't write to be answered. He wrote to make sure that if there was any conscience left in the system, it wouldn't let people keep working the same way. And something shifted. At a federal police academy, the training director received the letter and read it at his desk. He didn't escalate it, but the next day he updated the rapid response drills to include pre- and post-simulation psychological evaluation. Jerome's name was never mentioned in the paperwork, but a new line was added at the end of the training session. Note, speed of response is not an objective unless context is fully understood. At a Southern military school, the letter was temporarily posted on the instructor's bulletin board. A senior cadet snapped a photo and shared it to the school's internal forum. The most shared line wasn't the sharpest. It was the last line of the letter, quiet but deeply unsettling to anyone who had ever taught force and authority. Every time you teach someone to carry a weapon without teaching them to fear it, you are drafting an indictment the victim will never get the chance to read. There were no memos from the department, no nationwide training reforms. But in many classrooms, instructors began speaking more slowly during use-of-force limitation lessons. Some added an extra prompt in scenario assessments. What if the person in front of you isn't a suspect, but someone who knows the law better than you do? Jerome received no official response, but he didn't need one, because he knew that when a system that once ignored the silent begins to quietly pay attention to a man who refused to give speeches but wrote by hand, then that letter had already traveled further than any speech ever could. 3 weeks after the Westbrook incident, just as the media began shifting its focus away from Jerome Carter, an independent investigation unit was dispatched to work with the Millstone Police Department to review the city's entire surveillance camera system. Their first task was clear: extract, restore, and assess all footage related to the moment of the firearm incident, taken from at least 7 angles around the main Westbrook intersection. But as the technical team accessed the central storage system, something strange occurred. The footage between 2:52 p.m. and 3:04 p.m. was entirely missing, not deleted, not edited, but overwritten by backup data stream due to temporary server processing error. That was the initial report from the city's System Operations Department. On the surface, it sounded plausible. Servers crash, overloads happen. But when technicians reviewed the access logs, they found something harder to explain. The system overloaded at only 2 critical moments: when Jerome Carter presented his military ID and when Simmons drew his gun and aimed it at Carter's head. 30 seconds before that, everything was intact. 5 minutes later, the footage resumed as normal. In a press conference, the city spokesperson emphasized the data loss was a technical malfunction with no human interference involved. But internally, a senior system engineer who declined to be named simply shook his head. "I've been here 12 years. The system only overloads at the exact moment when someone wants it to." One member of the interagency task force recalled a 2018 incident involving police aggression where footage also accidentally disappeared and no one was ever held accountable. In the past year alone, Millstone had seen 3 complaints involving abuse of authority, each citing missing footage due to recurring system errors. And now, with Jerome Carter's case under public pressure and civilian recordings circulating, the cameras once again failed at the exact point. The coincidence was too calculated to be called random. But this time, unlike before, those trying to obscure the truth didn't realize they no longer held the originals. They didn't know that every frame from the Westbrook intersection, from residential cameras, satellite nodes, and intersection sensors, had already been captured in parallel and transmitted in real time, because the moment the strategic response protocol was activated, the entire zone had been automatically isolated from civilian systems. The footage was no longer within reach of those used to wiping the record. So even if they managed to erase it from the city's servers, what they wanted to disappear was already preserved by another system they no longer had access to. As whispers of the involuntary data overwrite began circulating among city IT teams, an encrypted message arrived from the Military Security Oversight Network to the Special Investigation Unit. No flashy subject, no explanation, just one line in italics in the email footer. Don't attempt recovery. We have backups, and we're watching. Within an hour, a technical delegation from Fort Belvoir, home of the Strategic Response Data Center, arrived in Millstone. They wore no uniforms, stated no titles, but brought with them real-time analysis tools and direct credentials for interagency surveillance protocols. Each carried an internal use tablet, no internet, no cloud access, used for a single action, uploading the original files. Every second of footage from Westbrook, residential cams, traffic sensors, bus dash cams, even behavioral scan feeds from the urban grid had been recorded live, from the moment Simmons stepped toward the SUV to the point Jerome Carter exited the vehicle with the special response team. No gaps, no blur, no corrupted audio. One analysis officer made it unequivocal. From the moment the SUR-AL-PHA protocol was triggered, the entire signal range around the subject was removed from civilian networks. Not a single byte remained on city infrastructure beyond the 15th second. That statement hit the room like a slap that didn't need volume, enough to leave the city tech teams speechless. They understood. The tricks of overriding, rerouting, and signal loss that had worked in previous cases no longer apply. They hadn't just lost access, they had lost the ability to rewrite the truth. What was more sobering, the footage hadn't just been backed up, it had been analyzed, tagged, triaged for response level, and forwarded directly to the Strategic Behavioral Intelligence Division at the Federal Security Headquarters. It was no longer city property. It didn't need Civil Rights Commission approval, and no apology could erase it. After the session, no official memo was signed, but one remark from the military representative stayed etched in everyone's memory. We're not interfering with your internal process, but in this case, the footage is no longer an administrative issue. It is a precedent-setting system of data, and precedent will not be erased. No one asked further questions. No one objected. From that day on, every Millstone server began showing a new maintenance warning. Gray-class signal zones are outside civilian data jurisdiction. Auto lock-in force. Tuesday, 7:40 p.m. No advance notice, no emails, no calendar entry on the internal coordination system. 7 individuals from various branches of the military and federal security were summoned to a meeting room deep within Section B, Level 5 of the Pentagon, a floor with no posted room names, no scheduled meetings, used only for sessions classified as non-responsive internally. The door bore only a code, REA Activation 12 Bravo. In the world of defense strategy veterans, that phrase required no explanation. It only appeared when a long-shelved program was being reconsidered for reactivation due to an emergency, significant enough to warrant reassessment. Inside, there were no clocks, no national flags, no ceremonial introductions. The chair, a representative from the Homeland Response Command, opened a folder, scanned the room, and spoke directly, without preamble. A strategic-level military officer was held at gunpoint in broad daylight by a domestic law enforcement agent, and the system's response, as you've seen, came far too late. This is not an incident. This is an alert. No one interrupted. No one asked for clarification. Everyone knew this wasn't a room for debate. It was for reestablishing what had been forgotten, that in an urbanized environment, the line between civilian and soldier is no longer clear, and unless local police behavior is restandardized, any officer could become the next target. The Navy representative reminded the room of a troubling statistic. In the past 5 years, there had been 17 tense encounters between plainclothes military personnel and local police in southern states. Most of them never officially recorded as violations. Another attendee pulled up a chart showing high-risk civil-military interaction zones. Over 60 counties had never received interagency coordination training. Everyone exchanged glances. No one denied anything. But no one yet proposed a next step until the officer seated at the far left, head of the Strategic Military Human Rights Program, placed a thick document on the table. Its cover read, "Draft Protocol for Law Enforcement Behavior when Engaging Military Personnel, version 2008. Originally developed after a 2007 conflict in Texas, the program had been shelved for lack of applicable scenario. Today it was back on the table, unchanged, untitled, anew. The session leader signaled to open the full document. No vote was needed, no approval from higher offices. A whiteboard was pulled up, displaying one clear line: Reinstate Program 12 Bravo URGent Review. The meeting continued for nearly 90 minutes without breaks. No jokes, no side conversations. Every minute focused on one issue: redefining how officers interact with soldiers in public, not through instinctual reaction, but through reasoned, and, at the end, one sentence was read aloud, with no objections. Uniform alone cannot be the dividing line between a threat and a person who belongs to the system. We must start retraining from the root. Jerome Carter entered the room midway through the discussion. He came alone. No aide, no documents. Just a pen clipped to the chest pocket of his white shirt, and the same expression seen in the Westbrook footage, calm, unprovocative, but unwilling to let anyone pretend the truth wasn't in the room. No one introduced him. No one needed to. At least 3 attendees had read his combat file. The officer who had commanded in Mosul, led the 1st Humanitarian Coordination Battalion in Kandahar, and, since 2015, was one of 4 authorized to independently oversee military-civilian conflict cases. But today, he wasn't invited to recount his achievements. He was present as a living witness, one whose survival spoke for itself. The system had reached its limit. When the coordinator read the agenda item for nominations for Framework Redesign Team, Jerome raised his head, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement of something he had already prepared himself for. He didn't say, "I accept." He didn't say, "I decline." He simply placed his hand on the table. A quiet gesture, but understood by all. He was willing to step in, but only on his terms. One person whispered, "I thought he'd say no." Another shook their head. No, a man who stayed calm at gunpoint isn't the type to walk away when the system finally opens a door. And they were right. Jerome hadn't come to join a reform. He came because he knew, if he wasn't in this room, someone else out there might be misunderstood, have a gun drawn on them, and next time, no one might raise a badge. In time, he took the draft program, the one shelved since 2008, and asked a single question that silenced the room. How many local officers today are trained to understand that someone in uniform also has the right to remain silent without being treated as suspicious? No one answered, but no one dared suggest it wasn't a question worth writing into the new curriculum. As the meeting adjourned, a coordinator, unnamed, typed a note into the internal system, tagged non-distributable. Jerome Carter didn't speak at length. He didn't cite his experience, but his presence made everyone in the room take a step inward. And maybe that, not any policy, is the reason this program finally has a chance of moving in the right direction. Outside, as Jerome left the room, a young officer stood to greet him. Not out of rank, but because he understood he had just witnessed a man who chose not to turn anger into retaliation, but into policy. There were no marches, no protest signs. But within 3 weeks of Jerome Carter having a police officer's gun pressed to his head, right in the heart of Millstone's residential zone, a coalition of lawmakers quietly convened on Capitol Hill. Not because of media pressure, but because they understood. This time, silence would mean complicity. Leading the group were Representative Harold Ayers, Republican, South Carolina, and Representative Valerie Dinn, Democrat, California, 2 names rarely seen together on any bill. But this time, they needed no negotiation. There had to be a legal framework to protect military personnel when operating in civilian spaces, not because they are special, but because they are trained to stay calm when others panic, and that discipline was now being misread as a threat. The draft bill was titled the Civilian Protection for Military Personnel Act. It made no mention of Simmons, no mention of Millstone Police, no use of Jerome Carter's name. But the preamble centered entirely around one idea. A person who once swore to protect this country should not have a gun drawn on them, simply because they didn't bow fast enough for the system's comfort. The bill came together in just 5 days. The advisory team included military liaisons, human rights experts, and a group of veterans who had once been wrongfully detained in traffic stops across the South. The proposal didn't demand a new agency. It didn't ask for billions in funding. It asked for one thing: that any incident involving improper treatment of military personnel by local law enforcement be transferred to an interagency investigation within 24 hours. One paragraph near the end made many readers sit upright. If someone under strategic protection can be mistaken for a threat, then it is the system that must be re-examined, not the individual forced to justify their identity at gunpoint. Though no formal link was declared, everyone knew this was Westbrook's direct consequence. Jerome Carter never appeared in Congress, never gave a speech, never went on air. But his silence had forced an entire power structure to say what he didn't need to shout. One legislative committee member, reading through a clause on field protocol, underlined the line, "Avoid use of force when no clear threat is presented," and scribbled in the margin, "If we need a law to remind officers not to shoot people for staying quiet, then this may be late, but it cannot be omitted." The bill was submitted with bipartisan sponsorship. A few far-right members objected, arguing the military shouldn't get special privileges in civilian life. But most responses were quiet, not out of agreement, but because no one dared publicly side with a man who drew a gun on a plainclothes colonel. That silence, for lawmakers, was the clearest signal. The system's legal boundaries needed rewriting. In the hallway, the day the bill was unveiled, a young legislative aide asked Representative Ayers, "Do you think Jerome Carter knows about this?" Ayers smiled and replied, "He knew the moment he stayed in that car. We're the ones who took 3 weeks to catch up to what he waited for, in silence." No one wrote Jerome Carter's name on the bill's header. No clause called him a victim. No sentence credited him with inspiring reform. But anyone who followed Westbrook knew this legislation wasn't driven by a trend. It came from one man who said nothing and still made an entire system take a step back. The bill, officially titled the Civilian Protection for Military Personnel Act, was released Monday morning at 8 a.m. in a quiet third-floor press room in Congress. No podium, no banners, just a single board at the center of the table. Drafted after a series of events that must not be repeated. Inspired by one man who said nothing, yet made the system stop. The quote wasn't signed, but everyone knew who it was for. The first clause in the act states, "Any active or retired military personnel classified under strategic operations appearing in a civilian setting will automatically trigger interagency oversight if a conflict with local police occurs. No complaint required. No name disclosed." Once the personnel code is verified, the entire response shifts from state to federal jurisdiction. The rest of the clauses, brief but direct, serve as systemic warnings. Mandatory law enforcement training on military personnel recognition. Absolute prohibition on drawing a weapon against non-aggressive or clearly unarmed individuals. And a requirement to store all interagency interaction data for a minimum of 30 days. From federal buildings to military academies, black and white prints of the bill began to circulate, but one copy, never published, was printed, placed in an unsealed envelope, and sent to Jerome Carter's address in Navy Hill. No signature, no note, just a small red stamp on the bottom corner. Final enacted, reference case, WST Bravo 1. Jerome didn't open it right away. He left it on the table beside an old pen and the notebook of unanswered questions he'd once written. Then he opened it. The first page held the legal text. The last page had just one italicized line. We used to think the uniform earned respect, but sometimes it's the silence in plain clothes that forces a system to redraw its boundaries. No fingerprint, no hashtag, no news headline covered it that day. But for thousands of service members across the country, for dozens of academies training the next generation of officers, and for anyone who ever asked, what if that man hadn't been a colonel, this law became the only answer the system ever dared to print, and no one dared to tear down. Jerome didn't speak. He didn't attend hearings. But somewhere, buried in 23 pages of legal text, between the cold weight of enforcement clauses, sat a single period, shaped like silence, left by a man who chose not to draw his weapon, so the system would be forced to retrain those who do. There was no press conference, no medal ceremony, no speech beginning with Colonel, Sir. After the bill bearing his name passed quietly through Congress, and after his story became a case study no one dared skim over in interagency security classes, Jerome Carter did one thing. He went home. That afternoon, no one was waiting outside. No journalists, no former colleagues, just a shaded tree on the lawn, a low wooden chair, and the familiar sloped roof house he had once stepped in and out of like any ordinary citizen, until the day a gun nearly ended it all. But he didn't walk in right away. He stood silently on the steps, eyes resting on the front door where it had all begun. His hands were steady, his heartbeat was calm, but no one could call it peace, because peace requires forgetting, and Jerome remembered every frame. 2 weeks earlier, a letter from the White House had arrived inviting him to receive the nation's highest civilian freedom medal. He didn't tear it up, but he didn't respond. The Office of Special Military Affairs sent an invitation, too, asking him to speak at the graduation of the next officer class. Jerome didn't refuse, but he didn't go. He didn't need another stage. The country had already seen what it needed to see, not to celebrate him, but to confront itself. At 5:45 p.m., the front door of the house opened. A young girl, about 10, ran out with a backpack on her shoulders, hair down, wearing a t-shirt printed with a world map, grinning widely. "I'm home," she called out, then froze when she saw him standing there, like part of the porch. No ceremony, no symbol, just him. Jerome nodded, smiled gently, and opened the gate for her to walk through. No one spoke of what had happened. No one needed to. Everything that needed saying had already been written down, signed in the cold ink of bureaucracy, and forced to live as fact. Some reporters still tried to follow up, sending interview requests. One production company pitched a documentary. A political group invited him to join a police reform campaign. Every letter was returned with a single handwritten note. "I am not an image. I am the consequence you don't want to look at." One former officer who had once served under Jerome came to visit, bringing a neatly folded uniform and a question. "Why won't you speak out?" Jerome poured tea, sat down on the wooden chair, and replied softly, like a breath, "Because I don't need anyone to apologize. I need them to stop killing people and then apologizing." That evening, he sat on the porch with a worn notebook in hand. Inside were no memoirs, no records of service, just a short list of unanswered questions. Why must survival come with a badge? How many without military ID or live streams never got to tell their story? When a soldier stays silent, should that be seen as a threat? When will justice arrive fast enough that it won't need explaining? He didn't expect answers, because he knew, sometimes, the mere existence of the question is already the greatest victory for someone once deemed invisible. A neighbor drove by, paused at the curb, and called over the fence, "You doing all right, sir?" Jerome simply nodded and turned away. Not out of resentment, not pride, but from now on, he no longer needed anyone to confirm he was okay. He just needed them to remember he almost wasn't here to be asked. And if that doesn't make him change, then no apology ever will. Justice doesn't need applause, doesn't need a stage. It only needs one person to stand still in front of a gun and not bow their head. The story of Jerome Carter is not one of a hero raising a flag in triumph. It is the story of a man who didn't draw a weapon, didn't shout, didn't stand on a podium, but still brought an entire power structure to a halt, forced it to look inward and confront questions it could no longer avoid. Why would a soldier who once served his country and kept silent as part of his discipline become the target of a drawn gun simply for not reacting according to a script playing in a local officer's mind? In today's society, is the real threat no longer behavior, but the courage to remain still and unafraid? And if that's true, how fragile is a system that sees calmness as danger? Jerome never asked for an apology. He didn't need a medal, nor to be labeled a model victim. What he did, with measured silence, was underline a simple truth. Don't rush to judge others just because they don't react the way you expect. Someone who doesn't bow isn't necessarily defiant. Someone who doesn't raise their hands isn't necessarily hiding something. Someone who remains silent isn't necessarily submissive. Sometimes, silence is all that's left when a person knows that any excess movement could be used as a reason for elimination, and that silence, when paired with identity, dignity, and resolve, can become the wall that prevents a system from pretending it saw nothing. The greatest lesson from this event doesn't lie in the passing of a bill. It doesn't lie in who got suspended, demoted, or praised. The true lesson is in how the system was forced to rewrite itself, not by mob pressure, not by signs or hashtags, but by the quiet presence of someone who refused to be defined by another's gaze. Jerome Carter didn't shout that he was innocent. He didn't justify himself with his military background. He simply sat there, military ID in hand, unshaken, unapologetic. And it was that unflinching composure that made an entire country ask, what does justice mean? If it only functions when we know who's standing in front of us? Don't judge others by your assumptions. A person's worth and capability should never be dismissed just because they don't wear symbols you recognize. And justice, if it truly is justice, must be strong enough to protect the quiet, not just the loud. Have you ever been underestimated because someone didn't understand you? Have you ever proved your worth without raising your voice? If so, this story is for you. Not as a moral cliché, but as a reminder. Some people don't need to speak the truth because their very presence is proof enough. If Jerome Carter's story made you think, share it. Not to praise one individual, but to let more people know. Calmness can be a form of resistance. Justice doesn't have to be loud, but it must be visible. And sometimes, instead of waiting for an apology, we can choose to make sure it never happens again. Don't forget to follow the channel for more stories where people don't need to be heroes to deserve dignity and respect.